In 1942, the skies above China were some of the most dangerous in the world. The war had already consumed continents. Cities burned. Armies marched across vast territories. And high above the mountains and rivers of China, enemy aircraft roamed the skies, searching for their next target. On a dusty airfield carved out of the rugged Chinese landscape, a lone American pilot adjusted his flight gloves and looked toward the horizon. His name was Robert L. Scott Jr. Beside him stood a weathered P-40 Warhawk, its shark-like nose painted for war. Mechanics hurried around the aircraft while distant engines echoed across the valley. The morning sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the runway. Scott wasn't thinking about fame. He wasn't thinking about books. He wasn't thinking about becoming one of the most recognizable fighter pilots of World War II. At that moment, he was focused on a much simpler goal: survive. The war in China was unlike anything most American pilots had ever experienced. Airfields were primitive. Supplies were scarce. The terrain was unforgiving. Yet every day, pilots climbed into their cockpits and challenged enemy aircraft in a battle for control of the skies. Robert Scott had always dreamed of flying. As a young man growing up in Georgia, aviation captured his imagination from the moment he first saw an airplane. Flight represented freedom, adventure, and possibility. While many young men pursued ordinary careers, Scott set his sights on the sky. His determination eventually earned him a place in military aviation. Years before America entered World War II, he trained relentlessly, mastering the demanding skills required of military pilots. Flying was never easy. Every takeoff carried risks. Every landing demanded precision. But Scott thrived in the cockpit. Then came Pearl Harbor. Everything changed. The attack pulled the United States into a global conflict unlike any in human history. Suddenly, trained pilots were desperately needed around the world. Scott found himself assigned to one of the war's most critical theaters, China. The journey was long and dangerous. By the time he arrived, he quickly realized that conditions were far tougher than anything he had experienced before. Airfields were often little more than rough strips of dirt. Weather could change without warning. Enemy aircraft were constantly searching for opportunities to strike. Yet despite the hardships, Scott embraced the challenge. Each mission carried enormous risks. Pilots frequently flew over mountains, rivers, and remote territory where a crash could mean capture, or worse. But danger never discouraged him. If anything, it sharpened his focus as he climbed into his P-40 Warhawk for another mission. The roar of the engine filled the air. Dust swirled behind the aircraft as it accelerated down the runway. Within moments, he was airborne. The landscape stretched beneath him like an endless painting of mountains and valleys. Somewhere beyond those peaks, enemy aircraft were waiting. And before the day was over, Robert Scott would find them. The sky seemed calm. Too calm. Experienced pilots understood that danger often arrived without warning. A distant glint of sunlight suddenly reflected off metal. Then another, and another. Enemy fighters. Scott pushed the throttle forward. The powerful engine responded immediately. The hunt had begun. The enemy fighters were closing fast. Scott tightened his grip on the controls and pushed the P-40 higher into the sky. The Warhawk wasn't the fastest fighter in the world, but it was tough, dependable, and heavily armed. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could be deadly. The Japanese aircraft ahead were already maneuvering. Within seconds, the peaceful blue sky exploded into chaos. Machine guns flashed. Tracers streaked through the air. Aircraft twisted and dove through the clouds as pilots fought for survival. Scott focused on a single fighter crossing in front of him. He knew hesitation could be fatal. The moment an opportunity appeared, he pressed the trigger. The P-40 shuddered as its guns roared. The enemy aircraft suddenly rolled to one side. Smoke poured from its engine. A few moments later, it disappeared into the mountains below. There was no time to celebrate. Another fighter appeared behind him. Scott threw the aircraft into a hard turn. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat. For several tense seconds, the enemy pilot tried to stay on his tail. Then Scott spotted an opening. He rolled, climbed, and reversed direction so quickly that the pursuing fighter overshot him. Now the tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. Back at the airfield, crews waited anxiously for the returning aircraft. Every mission carried uncertainty. Pilots who departed in the morning didn't always return by evening. When Scott's P-40 finally appeared over the horizon, mechanics rushed forward. The aircraft carried fresh bullet holes. Paint had been stripped away by gunfire. Yet the pilot climbed out, smiling. He had survived another day. As the months passed, Robert Scott became one of the most experienced combat pilots operating in China. His confidence grew with every mission. So did his reputation. Pilots respected his courage. Commanders admired his determination. Young airmen listened carefully whenever he shared lessons learned in combat. But Scott understood something many people did not. War was not glorious. For every victory, there were losses. For every successful mission, there were friends who never came home. The reality of combat weighed heavily on every pilot. Many nights, after the aircraft were secured and the airfields grew quiet, Scott sat alone with his thoughts. The sounds of distant generators echoed through the darkness. Maps covered nearby tables. Flight reports waited to be completed, yet his attention often drifted elsewhere. He began writing. At first, it was simply a way to record events. Names, places, memories, the details of a war that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. He wanted to preserve the experiences that ordinary reports could never capture. The fear before a mission, the loneliness of flying through hostile skies, the courage displayed by men facing impossible odds. Those notes would eventually become something far greater. But at the time, Scott had no idea. He was simply documenting a remarkable chapter of history as it unfolded around him. Meanwhile, the air war continued. Supply routes stretching across the Himalayas became critical to Allied operations. Pilots flew through some of the most dangerous weather conditions imaginable. Towering mountain peaks rose higher than many aircraft could safely climb. Sudden storms appeared without warning. Strong winds tossed airplanes like leaves. Many crews vanished while attempting these flights. The route became known as the Hump. Its reputation inspired both respect and fear. Scott witnessed countless examples of bravery from pilots flying those missions. Some returned with damaged aircraft. Others landed with barely enough fuel remaining. Many never returned at all. Every successful flight represented a triumph over both nature and the enemy. The challenges seemed endless. Yet Scott remained focused. Each day brought new missions, new risks, new stories. On one occasion, intelligence reports indicated enemy aircraft were preparing for an attack. Scott and several other pilots launched immediately. Their mission was simple: find the enemy before the enemy found them. Hours passed. Clouds drifted beneath their wings. The sky remained empty. Then, suddenly, movement appeared ahead. Enemy bombers, protected by fighter escorts. A dangerous combination. Scott knew the bombers could inflict devastating damage if allowed to reach their target. There was only one option: attack. The American fighters plunged toward the formation. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The bombers attempted to maintain formation, while escorts rushed to intercept the attackers. For several minutes, the battle filled the sky. Aircraft crossed paths at incredible speeds. Pilots made life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second. When the fighting finally ended, the surviving enemy aircraft retreated. The target below had been spared. For the people on the ground, the victory meant safety. For Scott, it was simply another mission completed. Yet moments like these steadily built his reputation. Stories spread throughout Allied forces. Pilots spoke of his skill and determination. His name became increasingly well-known. But fame remained the furthest thing from his mind. His focus stayed fixed on the next mission, the next challenge, the next day. As the war progressed, Scott's collection of notes continued to grow. Pages filled with observations and personal reflections, descriptions of combat, accounts of fellow pilots, lessons learned in the skies over China. What made his writing different was its honesty. He didn't portray pilots as invincible heroes. He described them as human beings. Men who experienced fear. Men who faced uncertainty. Men who continued flying despite the risks. Those qualities resonated deeply with readers later on. They recognized authenticity in his words. By the time the war began turning in favor of the Allies, Scott had accumulated enough experiences to fill an entire book. The title came from a simple phrase: God is my co-pilot. The words captured something many pilots felt but rarely expressed. Flying into combat often required faith, not necessarily confidence in victory. Faith that they could face whatever awaited them. Faith that they could continue despite fear. Faith that they would somehow find the strength to carry on. When the book was finally published, readers immediately connected with its message. It wasn't merely a war story. It was a personal journey, a first-hand account from someone who had witnessed history from the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. Sales skyrocketed. The book became a bestseller. People across America eagerly purchased copies. Many had sons, brothers, husbands, or fathers serving overseas. Scott's writing provided a glimpse into their world. For countless readers, it felt real in a way newspaper headlines never could. Soon, Hollywood took notice. A film adaptation followed. The title became famous throughout the country. Robert Scott transformed from a combat pilot into a national figure. Yet despite the recognition, those who knew him best noticed something remarkable. Success had not changed him. He remained the same determined pilot who had arrived in China years earlier. The same man who cared deeply about aviation. The same officer who respected the sacrifices of fellow servicemen. Whenever interviews focused on his achievements, Scott often redirected attention toward the countless individuals who served alongside him. He understood that victory in war was never the accomplishment of a single person. It belonged to thousands. Pilots, mechanics, ground crews, engineers, nurses, soldiers, each contributed in ways that history sometimes overlooks. That perspective earned him even greater respect. As World War II drew to a close, celebrations erupted around the world. The conflict had claimed millions of lives. Entire nations had been transformed. The generation that fought it would never forget what they experienced. For Robert Scott, the end of the war brought an opportunity to reflect. The young man who once dreamed of flying had traveled farther than he ever imagined. He had crossed oceans, fought in distant skies, survived dangers that few civilians could comprehend. And somehow, amid all of it, he had written a story that inspired millions. Years later, aviation enthusiasts continued reading God is my co-pilot. Historians studied its pages. Pilots found inspiration in its lessons. Its popularity endured because it captured more than combat. It captured character, courage, resilience, the qualities that allow ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. Today, Robert L. Scott Jr.'s legacy extends far beyond aerial victories. Many fighter aces achieved impressive records. Many skilled pilots served during World War II. But few managed to preserve their experiences in a way that resonated across generations. Scott did. Through his flying and his writing, Robert L. Scott Jr. preserved the experiences of a generation at war. The P-40s have long fallen silent, but his story lives on. Each time someone opens God is my co-pilot, they return to the skies above China, where courage was tested daily and one pilot chose to keep flying. That is why Robert L. Scott Jr. is remembered today, not only as a fighter ace, but as a storyteller whose legacy endures.